In this podcast, I'm going to explain why I don't want a Christian worldview. You've probably heard that term a lot. It's often used in apologetics. You hear people talk about worldview training, for example. Christians talk about wanting to develop a Christian worldview. But oftentimes, I cringe when I hear that term. Because most of the time, the folks who use it, they're not aware of all of the philosophical ideas that are loaded in that term. It's a loaded term, and it communicates so much. Oftentimes, the folks that are using the term don't know the philosophical history from where the term comes from. The philosophical ideas that led to the birth of the term. And so it's just become one of those buzzwords in apologetics that I guess I'm on the bandwagon to try to eliminate that term. So I don't want a Christian worldview, and I'll explain in this podcast why that's the case. This term really comes out of postmodern philosophy. If you're not familiar with postmodernism, I think, can be best understood as a series of philosophical movements in the 1800s and the 1900s that were all reacting against modernism, the extreme modernism of the 1700s. Modernism was characterized by, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and a real strong emphasis on objective truth, objective knowledge. And it led to all sorts of problems. There were all sorts of issues, and eventually modernism ran into a lot of dead ends. And it's out of really the explosion of modernism, out of the debris from the modernism explosion, that postmodernism is born. But the really, I guess, the hallmark of postmodernism is the idea of relative truth, that there is no objective absolute truth. If modernism put maybe too much emphasis on objective truth and had too much optimism about us achieving absolute truth, absolute knowledge of truth, objective truth, then postmodernism went way too far in the other direction. Like most movements that are reacting against a prior movement, they usually react too strongly. The pendulum swings too far the other way. And so what was birthed eventually out of postmodernism, all of these movements in the 1800s and 1900s, such as Romanticism and existentialism in the 1900s after World War II. But relative truth came from these postmodern philosophical movements. The idea that we don't know objective truth, or there is no objective truth. All we have are our subjective views of things. We're all stuck, really looking at the world through a certain lens, through a certain view. And this wasn't a good thing. They didn't see this as a positive thing. This was pessimistic about human knowledge, overly pessimistic, in my understanding. So the term worldview developed out of these postmodern movements that said that all truth is relative, all truth is subjective. Nobody's right or wrong. There is no absolute truth. We just have different views. We just view the world differently. We just have these different subjective views, and nobody's right or wrong. Now, I think there are times to talk. There are appropriate times to use that sort of subjective language, like opinions or views. So let's say we're talking about different flavors of ice cream, right? Or different types of pizza. We have different views about that. You might love pepperoni pizza. I might love, ham and pineapple on my pizza. So we have different subjective tastes, different subjective views about that. I think that's appropriate. Or humor. So one person might find a certain comedian, Chris Rock, just hilarious. And I might not. I might say, no, he's not funny to me. I find somebody like Brian Regan to be more funny. So we can talk about, our subjective views of comedians. And I think that's appropriate. But think for a moment when it's not appropriate, when it's clearly not appropriate to talk in terms of subjective opinions or subjective views. I mean, mathematics is the clear-cut example, right? We don't have different views about mathematical truths. I can't say, well, your view is that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but my view is that 2 plus 2 equals 5. No, we just don't talk like that when it comes to mathematics, because mathematics, that is a clear-cut case of things being objectively true. There is a right or wrong when it comes to math. There's not certain subjective opinions about it. It's factual. That's another good term to use when we're discussing things that are clearly objective, that it's factual. Scientific truths are another good clear-cut example. So when we're talking about, let's say, astronomy, just a simple scientific truth. In our solar system, the Earth, the planet we live on, is the third planet from the sun. Right? We don't have views about that. You don't have a view that's different than my view about that. No, that's just a factual truth that the Earth is the third planet from the sun. So those are two clear-cut examples. Another one might be in morality, at least clear-cut situations of morality, where we would say raping people is wrong. There's no view about that. That's just objectively the case, that rape is wrong. Whether you think that it's right or wrong doesn't matter. It is wrong. I would say it's objectively true just as much as 2 plus 2 equals 4. So there are times where it's appropriate to use subjective truth language. So different views about flavors, comedians, etc. The question becomes, when we're discussing Christianity, should we use more of those subjective opinion, subjective view type language terms, or should we use terms more akin to mathematics or scientific facts? Well, as you probably guessed by now, I would say we need to use more objective truth language when we're discussing Christianity, because we want to be crystal clear. This is one of the reasons I'm burdened about this, is because I know a lot of the apologists who are using this term worldview don't think that truth is subjective, right? But they keep using this term, and it miscommunicates then what we're actually saying. Because even though they might not use the term worldview to mean subjective truth, I guarantee you non-Christians, people in our culture, that's how they're interpreting it. Because we live in a postmodern culture. And if we're going to discuss our beliefs in Christianity as just our view, just our opinion, that's how the culture is going to interpret what we're saying. That we're not making objective truth claims, that we're just talking about our subjective truths. We're just talking about our opinions and our view. And they're not going to really grasp what we're trying to communicate, because that's not what we're trying to say. As apologists, we're trying to say, no, we believe that Christianity is objectively true. It's not just my view. It's not just my perspective. That Christianity really is true. That Jesus, for example, really did rise from the grave. That objectively happened in history. So I want to encourage apologists not to use that term anymore. I see it all the time. And even though they might not use it to mean subjective truth, I think because they're not aware of a lot of the philosophy behind it, that they in fact are using it that way. I'll just give you one quick example. I went to a talk earlier this year, an apologist, in his presentation, he talked about developing a Christian worldview. And then he went on to explain what a worldview is, and he brought up a picture on his slides, PowerPoint slides. He brought up a picture of tinted glasses. I believe they were rose tinted. And he said, look, we all see the world differently, and he used these tinted glasses as an example. And I'm just having a conniption fit. I didn't say anything, I didn't want to be inappropriate, but in my mind, I'm thinking, no, that's not what we're trying to communicate. Now, I recognize that we all have biases. I recognize that sometimes it's difficult to know what's objectively true. But here's the deal. I don't want a view of reality. I want to know reality itself. Okay? That's why I don't want a Christian worldview. I don't want to see the world through a certain tinted glass. I want to see it as it actually is. And if I'm wrong and Christianity is not true, well, I want to know that. If Jesus really wasn't really resurrected, I want to know that. I want to know what is objectively true. And I know there's difficulty in that. I know we all have biases. But we need to make sure that when we're talking about Christianity, that we're explaining that we see these things, we believe that these things are objectively true. If you want to know a little bit more about this issue of epistemology, just this idea of how we can know reality, epistemology is just the fancy term used in philosophy to talk about how humans know things. How do we develop knowledge? And as I said, in modernism, there was probably a little bit too much optimism about how we could know things and know objective truth. They believed we could know things with absolute certainty. And when that kind of crashed and burned, postmodernism went too far the other way and said, well, we can't know anything at all. We can't know objective truth at all. We're just stuck in all of these with relative truth, because all we have are subjective relative views as to how we see the world. So I find that there's a good middle ground position out there called critical realism. And critical realism tries to find a middle ground between the extreme optimism of modernism and then the pessimism of postmodernism. And some of the big names in the movement called critical realism would be Michael Polanyi, and another one would be John Polkinghorne. Now, they were both a world-famous scientist. Polkinghorne was a science professor, I think physics, if I remember right, science professor at Cambridge University. And Polkinghorne then became a Christian and worked in the area of theology and philosophy. So you can look him up, John Polkinghorne, professor at Cambridge in the 20th century. And he is one of the big names in this movement called critical realism. Or on my website, convincingproof.org, there's a paper that I wrote comparing Francis Schaeffer and Michael Polanyi, comparing their epistemologies and discussing this issue of critical realism. But all I'm saying in this podcast is I'm encouraging folks not to use the term worldview because it's a loaded term and there's a lot of philosophical baggage that goes along with the term that we don't want to communicate. We don't want to be misinterpreted to the people that we're trying to reach. So what do I describe? How do I describe my beliefs in Christianity then if I don't use the term worldview? Well, I just say it as simply as that. I just say that it's certain beliefs that I have about reality. Sometimes I say, it's a set of beliefs or a system of beliefs. But I don't categorize my beliefs. I don't say, well, these are my religious beliefs. These are my moral beliefs. These are my political beliefs. These are my scientific beliefs. These are my mathematical beliefs. I just say, no, I've just got a whole series of beliefs about reality. I'm sure some of them are wrong. I'm sure some of my beliefs are wrong. But I don't categorize them as different beliefs. Because as soon as you start doing that, you'll again be misinterpreted as just talking about subjective relative truth. If you just talk about your religious beliefs, the world has been, our culture has been so influenced by postmodern philosophy that as soon as they hear the term religious beliefs, they're just going to think subjective truth. That's just your view. Or where we want to say, no, we're claiming that Christianity is objectively true. This is why sometimes I use phrases that bother some Christians if they don't understand why I'm using them. But I'll use phrases when I teach or when I'm talking to somebody, and I'll say things like, I believe Christianity is true, but I could be wrong. Does that mean I'm not confident that Christianity is true? No, that's not what I'm communicating. What I'm communicating by saying I could be wrong is that I'm discussing something that is propositional truth, that is either objectively true or objectively false. That's the realm in which I'm discussing. Subjective views like your favorite flavor of ice cream doesn't have an objective truth to it. So we want to be clear when we're talking about Christianity that we're not discussing just our perspectives of things. We're discussing something that we're claiming is objectively true, just like a mathematical truth or a scientific truth. And we could be wrong. That's why we want to say that from time to time, to make it clear that we're discussing things that can be right or wrong. Somebody's favorite flavor of ice cream can't be right or wrong, right? Can't be true or false. That's their subjective preference. So we want to explain, we want to use our words very carefully so that we communicate that we're talking about objective truth here. Another thing that I say sometimes is when I'm teaching or talking to somebody is that I'll say, if Christianity is true, and I believe it is, then we should live like this, or we should do this, or we should believe this. But that's how I'll start out the sentence sometimes. I'll say, if Christianity is true, and I believe it is, then this follows. Again, trying to get my audience to realize that I'm claiming that these things that I'm discussing, I believe are objectively true. So it's just important when we use language that we are careful about how we communicate and what we communicate, because we might be communicating something that we don't intend to. And this is so important as we're trying to help people and point people to faith in Christ. We want to use language that doesn't confuse them and helps them to understand exactly what we're doing, exactly what we're saying, so we can point them to faith in Christ.